Dear Dr. Michael Jonathan Green and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wish you all a happy new year 2021 and welcome to the nice webinar on US-Japan ties and the future of Indo-Pacific. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Indo-Pacific affairs is one of the major research interests of NICE. The Indo-Pacific region has emerged as a major center for geostrategic interest. As a political and strategic concept, it has gradually established in the foreign policy legion of some countries, especially the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. To speak on the important topic of today, we have invited Dr. Michael Jonathan Green. Dr. Michael Jonathan Green is a Senior Vice President of Asia and Japan Chair at the Center of Strategic and International Studies and Director of Asia Studies at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at George Washington University. He has served on the staff of the National Security Council from 2001 to 2005, first as the Director for Asia Affairs with responsibility for Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and then as a Special Assistant to the President of National Security Affairs and Senior Director of Asia with responsibility for East Asia and South Asia. Before joining the National Security Council staff, he was a Senior Fellow for East Asia Security at the Council of Foreign Relations, Director of the Edwin Reischauer Center and the Foreign Policy Institute, and Assistant Professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Research Staff Member at the Institute of Defense Studies, and Senior Advisor on Asia in the Office of Secretary of Defense. He also worked in Japan on the staff of the member of the National Diet. Dr. Green is also a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, a distinguished scholar at the Asia Pacific Institute in Tokyo, and professor by special appointment at Sophia University in Tokyo. He is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the Aspen Strategy Group, the America-Australia Leadership Dialogue, the Advisory Board of Radio Free Asia, and the Center of New American Security, and the editorial board of the Washington Quarterly and the Journal of Unification Studies in Korea. He also served as a trustee at the Asia Foundation, senior advisor at the Asia Group, and associate of the US intelligence community. Dr. Green has authored numerous books and articles on East Asia security, including most recently by More Than Providence's Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia Pacific since 1973, which is published by Columbia University Press in 2017. He received his master's and doctoral degree from SAIS and did additional graduate and postgraduate research at Tokyo University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He received his bachelor's degree in history from the Kenyon College with highest honors. He holds a black belt in Iaido, which is sword, and has won international prizes on the great highland bagpipe. Dr. Green, it is our privilege to have you with us. We are really honored for your kind presence. You will have around 30 to 35 minutes to make your presentation, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their questions in the chat box or under Facebook Live. Dr. Green, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much to all of the organizers at the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. I am very pleased to be with you. I am trying to explain to my children that I'm visiting Kathmandu this morning from my study in Bethesda, Maryland. And my wife has been to Nepal many times in her work for the Asia Foundation. And someday soon, I hope to visit you in person. Maybe not now, it's a bit cold for me in Nepal, but maybe in the summer sometime. So I would like to share with you my interpretation of the broad geopolitical trends among the key maritime democracies in Asia, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And to do that, I'm going to draw both on my experience in the government, although I'm speaking only my personal views, and also as a political scientist and historian. I published a book, as you heard, on the history of US strategy in Asia in 2017. and I'll shortly have another book coming out on the history of Japan's strategy towards Asia. And so I want to describe the roots, the historical roots, the geopolitical and cultural roots of American and Japanese, and perhaps Indian and Australian strategy, and why you now have this convergence of these maritime powers at a time of rising Chinese power and shifting political tectonic plates in the Indo-Pacific. As I'll mention in a moment, American strategic thinkers anticipated this would happen 150 years ago. What you're seeing in the so-called Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India alignment, was part of the writings of American naval officers in the 1850s. So, and in the roots of Japanese thinking as well. So I want to do a little bit of history to try to give context and conclude with some thoughts on what this means for Nepal and for a part of the Indo-Pacific that is not maritime, the Himalayan plateau. It's an area I have great interest in, but not great expertise. So I'll end my talk with some thoughts on what this means for Nepal and Sino-Indian relations, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and I look forward to questions that might enlighten me, even if I'm not able to answer them. In terms of the United States history in Asia, I began my book by More Than Providence actually in 1783. The American Revolution was not over. British troops were still in North America. Colonists were still fighting for independence. And in that year, 1783, Thomas Jefferson, who later became, of course, Secretary of State, Vice President, and President, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Colonel George Rogers, who was on the frontier of the American colonies in the mountains of what would today be West Virginia or Pennsylvania. And Thomas Jefferson told Colonel Clark, who was fighting the British and their proxy Native American forces, that American spies in London had learned that the British were raising funds to send an expedition across Canada to find a passage to the Pacific Northwest. And Jefferson argued that once the independence had been established from Britain, the US, the new colonies, the new states, the United States would have to move quickly to ensure that they had control over what is today the state of Oregon and Washington, the Pacific Northwest. And that's the earliest document showing American strategic thought about the Pacific. But the thing is, Thomas Jefferson was not only thinking about consolidating North America from the eastern seaboard to the west coast. He was very aware of the Pacific. He had dined with an eccentric American named John Ledyard, who had joined the Royal Navy, actually the Royal Marines, and served on the ship of Captain Cook in the 1770s, traveling to the Hawaiian Islands, to Australia. And when the American independence movement began, John Ledyard left the Royal Marines. He jumped ship, he defected, and he told Thomas Jefferson and other leaders of the revolution about the Pacific, about Japan, about the Hawaiian Islands, about sea otter pelts off of Oregon that were popular in Canton, in Guangzhou, with the Hong merchants. And so from the beginning of the American Republic, there has been a focus on American access to Asia and preventing rival hegemons, rival powers, from keeping the United States out. And at that time, of course, the rival hegemon was Britain. Later, Americans were concerned about German expansion in the late 19th century. And then, of course, in the first part of the 20th century, Japan. And the United States and Japan fought a brutal, brutal war over who would control the Pacific. And then in the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union. And in each of these episodes, as a major power threatened to assert hegemony over the Indo-Pacific, and in particular the Pacific, which was the American gateway to Asia, but also a source of vulnerability from Asia. Americans wanted the Pacific to be a conduit for trade, for democracy, for religion. There were missionaries proselytizing the Christian faith. And they did not want the Pacific to be a conduit for hostile powers to approach us. It was our buffer, but there was recognition from the beginning of the American Republic by the handful of people who thought about foreign policy that we could not let a rival hegemonic power dominate the Pacific. And every rival hegemonic power that challenged the United States was blocked. The British, in part because the British didn't have the power to challenge the US. And by the end of the 19th century, the British government realized the Americans and the Japanese were useful partners in maintaining a balance of power against a resurgent Russia, and in Europe, Germany, which was building its navy. So we never fought the British in the Pacific. Actually, that's not true. During the War of 1812, one American ship, the USS Essex, crossed into the Pacific, the first American ship to enter the Pacific, and it sank the entire British whaling fleet before the Royal Navy finally sank it. But American Britain did not fight. Japan and Germany and the United States did not fight in the Pacific at the end of the 19th century. Japan and the United States did. And in the Cold War, although the Soviet Union and the US did not fight directly, our proxies fought, and we fought, Americans fought in Korea and in Vietnam. The American approach to hegemonic challenges has been to restore a favorable balance of power. That's why we built a network of bilateral alliances in the Pacific after the Korean War, when we were threatened. But often the American political system is a little bit slow to respond to these challenges. The current challenge for the United States, of course, is China, and it's complicated. Unlike the Soviet Union, which only accounted for less than 1% of American trade, China accounts for about 15% of American trade. There's a level of economic interdependence with China that we never had with the Soviet Union. So confronting the hegemonic ambitions of the Chinese, and I should add that in Washington, after much debate, there is now broad consensus that under Xi Jinping, China does have hegemonic ambitions in Asia that do challenge the existing system that the United States and its allies built. That doesn't mean there will be war. It doesn't mean there will be military clashes. But there's broad consensus in the US now that China seeks a hegemonic control over Asia, peacefully, if possible, but that Beijing is willing to take considerable risk to achieve its ambitions, whether that's building artificial islands and fortifications in the South China Sea, or placing major economic embargoes on countries like Korea or Australia that are US allies when those countries side with the US. So there's broad consensus in Washington that we face a major hegemonic challenge. And the Trump administration made that clear in 2017 when its national security strategy declared the US and China are in strategic competition. When I was in the White House for President George W. Bush, I worked on the US national security strategy documents as well. And in 2002 and in 2005, we said the US and China had aspects of competition, but that we faced common challenges like terrorism that we needed to work together on, that those would define the US and China as partners rather than rivals. And most Americans in opinion polls agreed. The Obama administration in its national security strategy in 2010 said the US and China will work together on climate change and the global financial crisis and will be partners, not rivals. And most Americans agreed. But over the last 5 or 6 years, opinion polls in the United States have changed, views in the Congress have changed, and most Americans now think China is a rival more than a partner. And that view is particularly strong in Congress. And it was articulated by the Trump administration as strategic competition. And the Trump administration chose as its label or its definition of our strategy the term Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. It's an interesting phrase. Indo-Pacific brings in South Asia fundamentally to the strategic view of the China problem for the United States. Free and open emphasizes values. But what's particularly interesting is the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. That name was not made in the United States. It was made in Japan. It was the Japanese Foreign Ministry that coined the phrase Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Now, I told my Japanese friends they deserve some credit for this name and this concept of allies and maritime democracies aligning more closely to preserve a balance of power in Asia and stability and prosperity. But I also pointed out to my Japanese friends that the original idea for this, as I mentioned at the outset, is actually American. When Commodore Matthew Perry sailed to Japan on his so-called black ships in 1853 and opened Japan to the world, he returned to New York, and for the rest of that decade, he gave speeches about the Pacific. Now, most Americans in the late 1850s were not listening because this was in the period before our Civil War. And people were not thinking about the Pacific. But what Commodore Perry said in his speeches was, someday, well, the Pacific will be our future. This is in 1856, 1857. Someday, we will secure the Pacific with the Cross of St. George and with Japan, with the British and the Japanese. And then at the end of the 19th century, Alfred Thayer Mahan, a naval officer and one of the most important American strategic thinkers in our history, wrote that someday the Pacific would be secured with the navies of the United States, Japan, Britain, and Germany, the Quad of 1898. Germany was knocked out of Asia by World War I, and the US and Japan became enemies. But that vision is back. Perry's maritime alignment, Alfred Thayer Mahan's maritime alignment, if you think about it, the United States and Japan and Britain. But if you replace Britain with India and Australia, with two British colonies, you essentially have the Quad. So this idea of aligning with maritime democracies has a long history in American thinking, particularly among naval strategists, but among grand strategists. And it has a history in Japan because it was the Japanese who proposed the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, to the Americans, to the Trump administration. You know, Donald Trump ran on one thing, and that one thing was Donald Trump. He was an egomaniacal salesman, and he had no strategy. He was a populist. It turns out a very dangerous populist. If you're following American politics, our politics have now become even more complicated and interesting than Nepal's politics, with impeachment passed last night in the Congress. But Trump brought into office with him a group of conservative Republicans, national security hawks, who did not have a clear strategy and were searching for one. And it was Japan that helped them find it by briefing the new administration on Tokyo's idea, on Abe, Prime Minister Abe's idea for Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy. And this Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy has its own roots in Japanese history. Japan, of course, is an island nation. In many ways, Japan's history parallels Britain's. But when the British were building a navy in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries out of oak and seagoing frigates and men of war, the Japanese were using cypress trees, elegant, lightweight cypress trees, which were not worthy for seagoing ships. They were good for trade among the Japanese archipelago, the Japanese islands. There were some Japanese who argued in the 16th and 17th centuries and early 18th centuries that Japan someday would need a navy to defend itself against the Europeans. But at that time, Japan was a closed state. The Tokugawa government had shut Japan off from the world. And it was actually illegal, and you could be sentenced to death in Japan in the 17 and 1800s for talking about Western learning or for advocating a navy or Western technology, unless you were one of the very few scholars chosen near Nagasaki to work with a small Dutch trading post at Dejima in that port. But when Perry arrived in 1853, and when Japan suddenly realized that its security as an island nation was now threatened by powerful Western and European navies, the debate opened up. And a young samurai, a ronin, a masterless samurai, named Sakamoto Ryoma from Kyushu, was part of the Meiji Rebellion, the restoration that kicked out the samurai shogunate, the military government that had ruled Japan since the early 1600s, and restored the emperor and the imperial line. And Sakamoto was one of the key leaders, key revolutionaries in this. And Sakamoto was a swordsman and a brilliant young rebel. And he traveled to Edo, to Tokyo, to assassinate a man named Katsu Kaishu. And Katsu was the man who had built the first navy for Japan, for the Tokugawa government. And Sakamoto went to Katsu Kaishu to kill him with his samurai sword and assassinate him for betraying Japanese martial military spirit by embracing Western military thinking. But he became so fascinated and intrigued and charmed by Katsu's learning that he himself became a student of maritime strategy. And he issued an 8-point plan for Japan's modernization that was embraced by the Emperor Meiji, that said Japan would build a strong navy and a commercial empire and would be a partner with the maritime powers like the United States and Britain. And this was one vision for Japan as it modernized. But there was another vision that was more powerful, and that was driven by those who were trying to build a national army in Japan and a national identity in Japan as a modern nation state that could compete with the West, compete with imperialism. And that group dominated the army, the Imperial Japanese Army. And over time, that group came to argue that for its security, Japan must conquer China and Korea and the continental Asian powers and use the continent of Asia as a base to compete with the Western powers, to get iron and steel and magnesium and wheat from Korea and Manchuria and northern China as its imperial base to compete with America and Britain and France and the Dutch. And of course, that led to war with the United States and Britain and catastrophic defeat for Japan. And when Japan emerged from the war, it emerged as a pacifist country, renouncing war, but a country that would not challenge the maritime powers, that would align with the United States for its own protection. But the Japanese government and the mainstream Japanese politicians followed the thinking of the first post-war Prime Minister Yoshida. And Yoshida had been ambassador to Great Britain and was an Anglophile. He was pro-British. He thought the Americans were a little bit crude and unsophisticated, but he accepted that Japan would have to be protected by the US and aligned with the US. But in order to maintain Japan's independence, Yoshida pushed for closer ties to China, reconciliation from the war, in part so that the Japanese would not need to rely on the US too much for its security, and Japan could have more independence. And Yoshida also focused on economic recovery, going back to one of the earlier Meiji ideas, Fukoku Kyohei, rich nation, strong army, but without an army, just a rich nation, independent because of high technology. And Japanese economic growth was miraculous after the war. And the third part of Yoshida's strategy was to use pacifism, to use the Japanese people's hatred of war and Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which renounces war as a right of the state, to ensure that Japan would never be asked by the United States to participate in the Cold War in a military way, that Japan would never be asked to do what Australia or South Korea or Thailand or the Philippines or South Vietnam were asked to do, which is fight. And for many, many decades, the Japanese government said, we cannot play a military role with the United States because Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution says we're not allowed to. Technically speaking, the United Nations Charter allows all countries the right of individual self-defense. And so Japan does have a self-defense force and has since the 1950s for self-defense. The UN Charter also allows collective defense, and Japan has that right. And the Japanese lawyers have concluded Japan has that right. But the government said, based on the spirit of Article 9, we will not exercise that right. And so Japan will never do joint military operations with the United States, except to defend Japan when it's directly attacked. What happened over the last 20 years, and it's particularly under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, who came back to power after a short earlier failed leadership, came back to power in 2012. What happened was the Japanese government, the Japanese politicians, and eventually the Japanese public decided this formula would not work. Japan now faced a major challenge from China. And the only way to deal with it was to move more closely towards the United States. And so Abe in 2014 and 15 pushed through new legislation and changed how Japan interprets its peace constitution to now allow collective self-defense. So for the first time since 2015, the US and Japan are able to plan for military operations together beyond Japan, if it's a contingency that affects Japan's security. So there are some constraints, but under Abe, Japan has embraced closer security relations with the US, even if it risks entrapment in conflicts, because the China pressure on Japan is so great. In the East China Sea, Chinese ships are surrounding the Japanese-occupied Senkaku Islands. In Southeast Asia, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is competing with Japan. Japan is by far the most popular country in Southeast Asia, but China is throwing a lot of money to build infrastructure with Belt and Road in a region that's critical for Japan. And so competition with China for Japan is at a point where there is no choice but to move closer to the US. In some ways, this is the oldest story in Japanese history. When the Japanese imperial line was established sometime around the 7th century, the Japanese chose the Chinese character for emperor, the same as the Chinese, to show the Chinese that Japan was not subservient to China, that Japan, even though Japan was a much weaker state. So in one sense, Japan has been competing with China since the 7th century. But in the post-war period, the Japanese did not want to compete with China and thought they were richer than China and thought China would be their friend in building some more balance in their relation with the US. But the China that emerged, especially under Xi Jinping, was not a friendly China to Japan. Japan has economic interests in China that are very strong, does not seek conflict, but has a very active strategy to counterbalance Chinese hegemonic ambitions. The core of that strategy is the United States. And the key to that relationship is Abe's decision in 2014 and 15 to allow collective defense with the Americans for the first time. The other piece of the Japanese strategy, of course, is alignment and cooperation beyond the United States, beyond the security treaty with the US. So in 2007, Japan, when Abe was prime minister the first time, and Australia signed a security agreement. It was not a security treaty ratified by their parliaments, guaranteeing protection, but it was an agreement to expand defense and intelligence cooperation. Then in 2008, Japan signed a similar agreement with India. And it was in 2006 and 7 that Abe proposed the Quad. He proposed a summit of the US, Japan, Australia and India. And he did that because he had seen what happened in 2004 and 5. Boxing Day 2004 was when the massive Asian and Indian Ocean tsunami struck. And within 48 hours, the US Navy, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the Royal Australian Navy, and the Indian Navy formed a joint task force and together provided emergency relief, demonstrating how logical and in some ways how easy it was for these four maritime powers, the maritime powers that Matthew Commodore Perry and Alfred Thayer Mahan had anticipated would someday be critical to peace in the Pacific. It demonstrated how easy it was to operate together. And Abe liked that idea, and he said, let's make a summit. In 2006 and 7, that was too much. People thought it was too provocative towards China. But now the Quad is back and has support in Tokyo, in Washington, in Canberra, and now increasingly in India. And I'll end with India, which this audience will know better than I do, although I worked on India policy for President Bush. India, of course, has two strategic traditions in a way. There's the Nehruvian non-alignment tradition, but there's also the Curzonian great game, the tradition of trying to impact the balance of power in Asia. And for most of India's history as a republic, the Nehruvian non-alignment strategic culture, it seems to me, has dominated. But with the growing Chinese hegemonic ambitions, this Curzonian aspect of Indian strategic culture, inherited from Lord Curzon during the period of the Raj, has become more and more pronounced in the view of at least many Americans who watch India. And Japan makes a very interesting partner for India. Japan actually, though it was a close US ally, joined the non-aligned movement summit in Bandung in 1955. Japan and India have been apart from each other for many, many reasons. The Japanese companies didn't really have interest in the Indian economy because of Nehruvian socialism and the difficulty of doing business. The Japanese pacifists were angry at India for its nuclear tests. The connections between Japan and India were primarily connections between the right wing of the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party and conservative Indian political leaders like George Fernandez. And the Japanese right wing, the conservatives, admired India. It was the Indian judge, Judge Paul, who in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal dissented from the Americans and the Australians and the Canadians and British, and said Japan was not guilty of aggressive war, of violating the so-called Treaty of Paris. And Japanese conservatives, many of whom think Japan deserves less blame for the war, have always sort of admired that. But it was a strange relationship because it was really only the hawks on the right in Delhi and Tokyo who had a connection. But that changed in the 2000s for both countries. For Japan, India became a logical partner as a democracy to help stabilize the Indo-Pacific. And Japanese investment and aid to India surged. India became the #1 recipient for a time of Japanese loans, yen loans in yen-denominated loans from the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. And on a bipartisan basis with the Congress Party and the BJP, with the Liberal Democratic Party and the Democratic Party of Japan, on a bipartisan basis, throughout the 2000s to this day, both governments have continued to build Japan and India cooperation. The US also has stronger ties with India. The US now does more military exercises with the Indian military than the rest of the world does combined. But the Japanese are particularly easy, I think, for India to work with because of the history of the two countries and because of Japan's strong position in Asia and popularity in Asia. And then there's Australia. The Australians have also developed a bipartisan consensus around the Quad. The Labour Party on the left rejected it in 2007, but now the Australians have warmed to the Quad. And you see the Australians coming around to it. The weakest leg of the Quad has always been Australia and India, in part because the Australian Labor Party has been skeptical of India. The Australian Labor Party blocked uranium exports to India because of proliferation concerns. My cynical view is that within New Delhi and within the Ministry of External Affairs, keeping Australia at some distance has always been a way to signal to Beijing, to the Chinese, that India is not trying to contain China. But after what happened in Deccan, when the People's Liberation Army clashed with the Indian Army and killed dozens of troops, it seems to me Delhi is embracing the Quad more and bringing Australia in. So I'll end with that. And just one final thought on Nepal. What I've described is the alignment of 4 maritime powers to stabilize the Indo-Pacific. So what does that mean to a country like Nepal that is landlocked, is definitely not a maritime power, is geopolitically at the epicenter of Eurasian geopolitics, but is not a maritime power? So how can this alignment, which has historic roots of these 4 maritime democracies, matter to Nepal? I think it matters in a few ways I'll end with. One is China's freedom for maneuver will be shaped by how much Beijing views alignment externally. And the Chinese strategy is to expand its influence and control over many parts of Asia, but without war and without counterbalancing, without the other powers trying to contain China. So to the extent that the Quad is becoming a reality, it's a strong strategic signal to Beijing that if China pushes too hard, the maritime powers will come together, and collective security, which does not exist in Asia. NATO in Europe is a collective security organization. In Asia, it's bilateral treaties and partnerships. But the Quad signals the possibility that Chinese moves could create a kind of counterbalance, even containment strategy. So the Chinese have to be careful. The Quad establishes some parameters for how much China can push. And that even extends to developments in Nepal. After all, it was a military clash in the Himalayan mountains that led India to invite Australia into the Malabar naval exercises. So the maritime and mountain domains are linked. The second reason it matters is because the Japanese FOIP strategy is not about containing China. Japan is not going to countries and saying, don't do Belt and Road. In fact, the Japanese government has said to China, we will cooperate with Belt and Road in some cases. But Japan's strategy is aimed at giving countries, developing countries, alternatives to Belt and Road, what the Japanese call quality infrastructure. No debt traps, more transparency, more attention to the environment. And America and Australia, and I think under the Biden administration, increasingly Europe, are going to join Japan in that provision of an alternative for development and infrastructure. There's too much infrastructure demand for China or Japan or the US or any one country to dominate financing of infrastructure. The Japanese strategy, which America and others will follow, is to have competition so that countries like Nepal or Sri Lanka or the Maldives can choose, can have a menu and have more agency, have more control over their infrastructure development. And then the third way I think it matters, even though it's a maritime coalition, is this is a group of countries that in different ways believes democracy matters. And we have all had our challenges, and the US has particular challenges right now. But this is a group of countries that's trying to define order in Asia. And the views on democracy support are very different from Delhi to Washington to Canberra and Tokyo. But the success and resilience of democracies all over the region matter to these countries. And so what's happening in Nepal right now, which is very hard to follow from the outside, does matter to the outside world. So I'll end with that, Professor. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Green. It was really interesting presentation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure all our participants also benefited immensely from your lecture. We have received lots of questions, so let me move to the questions directly. What is your thought on New Delhi's proposal to start a new trilateral for the Indo-Pacific involving Japan and Russia? What is Japan's role? Why is Japan's role so crucial in this trilateral in the backdrop of Japan-Russia ties? Would Russia's involvement also spell a blow on America's Indo-Pacific vision and be a potential invite to China to be part of Indo-Pacific construct in the future?
So I wrote a book with a colleague of mine about 10 years ago about multilateral institution building in Asia. And often scholars refer to this as the architecture of institutions in Asia. And we decided not to call our book Architecture. Instead, we called it Asia's New Multilateralism, because architecture suggests some intelligent design. And there is no real intelligent design to multilateralism in Asia. In Europe, the European Union, even NATO, have a logical construct, because you have a community of nations bound by strong economic ties, relatively close levels of economic development, and challenges in Hungary or Poland notwithstanding democratic constitutional governments. In Asia, you have radically different levels of economic development, very different political systems and regime types, complicated, diverse geography, and very diverse threat assessment. And so while there are some broad multilateral institutions in Asia, the SARC in South Asia, the ASEAN Regional Forum and East Asia Summit, APEC in the Pacific Rim, these are not strong multilateral institutions. They can sometimes have a role in agenda setting, but they're non-binding. They can easily be broken if a major power defies the consensus of the group. And so that's why I think you have increasingly an array of smaller minilateral groupings. The Quad, the BRICS, sometimes US, Japan, Korea. You have a US, Japan, Australia trilateral. So my view of something like Japan, Russia, India trilat is the United States should not worry too much about that. Governments want to have tools. Some scholars call it forum shopping. No multilateral institution in Asia has anything like NATO or the EU's power to set the trajectory and agenda of the region. And so countries want options. You know, Australia and Japan are in all kinds of groupings. So it's not surprising to me that New Delhi would want this new trilateral. And to me, it's another example of why Japan is such a comfortable partner for New Delhi. It carries so little baggage, but has real strategic heft in the region. Why Russia? I mean, I don't know what the MEA and scholars who propose this are thinking, but one thing to keep in mind is that India buys a considerable amount of its kit from Russia, fighter jets, armored fighting vehicles, does not do military exercises with Russia, and does not have any strategic alignment with Russia, but does have an interest in cooperation with Russia in a way the US does not. And Japan has its own interest in Russia because of the northern territories, the islands occupied by the Soviets after World War II, and the 4 islands Japan claims that are still occupied by Russia. And the Japanese government sees some utility in keeping a channel open to Moscow to see if there's a way to resolve that politically sensitive issue in Japan, although few Japanese think it will be resolved. And also to see if they can slow down Russia's alignment with China, which I think probably corresponds with India's interests. I seriously doubt that this trilateral will have any significant impact on the agenda in Asia. The common interests of India, Russia, and Japan are not very extensive. The Russians will criticize the United States, Japan will push back, and India might push back. India, and especially Japan, will urge Russia to do more to establish its independence from China, to not become an ally with China. And the Russians will ignore that because Putin is determined to work with China. So I don't worry about this. I think the media and some scholars will say this is embarrassing. I suppose to some extent there are people in the MEA who want to send some signal to China not to worry about the Quad. A lot of these groupings are signaling, but in terms of substantively setting the agenda, I don't worry about it. I don't think it's going to have an impact on US interests.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to the next question. What is the future of Indo-Pacific strategy under Biden administration? Will Biden administration seriously push for the Indo-Pacific strategy?
The short answer is yes. And yesterday, the White House announced that Dr. Kurt Campbell will be the senior coordinator for Indo-Pacific strategy in the White House, in the National Security Council. And I wrote a piece on foreignpolicy.com yesterday explaining why this is significant. And this morning, the editors told me it was one of the most read pieces they've ever had. I suspect 1.4 billion Chinese are reading it. The appointment of Kurt Campbell, who's a very close friend of mine, is significant because, number one, they called him coordinator for Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific concept in the Obama years was less accepted in Washington. People who were more, pro-China, if you will, who were more concerned about relations with China, opposed this concept and were skeptical of India and skeptical of the maritime strategy and thought China was the most important partner for the US. In 2012, in public opinion polls in the United States, actually, most Americans thought China was the most important partner for the US in Asia in the future, not Japan. But in 2019, in public opinion polls, 2/3 of Americans said we should strengthen an alliance with Japan, even if it hurts relations with China. The American attitudes have shifted. The Democratic Party in the United States has shifted. And Indo-Pacific, the idea of this maritime strategy, is clearly embraced by the Biden White House. They called this job the coordinator for Indo-Pacific, not Asia-Pacific. So they're embracing the basic construct that is Japan's, Australia's, and that the Trump administration, despite the many, many, many failings of Trump himself, that the Trump administration championed. The Biden team, some people in Japan and in India, in Australia are a little worried because the Biden team includes many former Obama administration officials. And the Obama administration was divided on China. Some officials thought the US needed to do much more cooperation with Japan and India to counterbalance China. Others thought we needed to work with China to avoid conflict and cooperate on climate change. And so this appointment of Dr. Campbell is a very strong signal where Biden's emphasis will be. But there are more people in the Biden administration who are going to emphasize cooperation with China in some areas like climate change. It will not be as confrontational towards Beijing as Trump was, which is probably a good thing. I think that's probably going to be more welcome in the region. Good question.
Let's move to the next question. What is the role of the latest declassified document related to the Trump administration on the US strategy for Indo-Pacific? What will be, how will that be taken by the Biden administration?
So the first thing that's so interesting about this is that the Trump administration's officials are frantically declassifying documents and making decisions in the final 2 weeks. And I think in part it's because they're so ashamed at what Donald Trump did on January 6th. None of his officials are standing up to defend him. The president of the United States incited a mob to attack the US Congress. We've never seen anything like it in our history. Some people say maybe the American Civil War, but it's just a stunning dereliction of duty. And it's why Trump got impeached with 10 Republicans and with the Senate Majority Leader, a Republican, McConnell, saying he might support convicting Trump. So his officials are saying nothing to defend him. But they are frantically declassifying and publishing the good work that they did. So I think part of this is they're trying to create a record for historians of some of the good things they did. And the fact is that some aspects of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy had merit. As I've mentioned, the alignment with Japan, the strengthening of the Quad. That I've written many of those kinds of classified documents when I was in the White House. And my first thought was, I wish I had declassified mine so that I could become famous too. But my second thought was, those documents were clearly organized by H.R. McMaster's, the second National Security Advisor, a three-star general, because they read very much like a military strategy. And that is their strength and their weakness. It's a strength because it's a very clear series of commands and orders for the strategy. It's a weakness because it's deficient in the areas that military officers tend not to address, like democracy and values, like trade and finance, like soft power. So my guess is the Biden administration is probably reading it out of curiosity and will probably follow 75% of it. But it will not, but coincidentally follow it, because I think there is a consensus in Washington about strategy in Asia now that's pretty broad. But I don't think it's a blueprint for them. They're going to come up with their own Indo-Pacific strategy. Kurt Campbell has written about 4 articles in Foreign Affairs the past year. And that gives people a bit of a clue what he's thinking. And he'll probably be the key drafter of the strategy for the Biden team. But he's a guy who is a Democrat, but I worked for him in the Pentagon before I worked for Bush in the White House. Randy Shriver, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Trump, worked for Campbell in the Clinton administration. So, the Asia policy makers in Washington, many of them, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, have at some point worked for Kurt Campbell. So I think he represents kind of the mainstream thinking now, which is this maritime strategy. Less confrontational towards China than Trump, but continuing the Indo-Pacific.
So the next question is, do you believe that a small Quad-like arrangement will spell end a mega alliance like NATO in the present day world?
In the present day world, no. India's non-alignment and independent foreign policy is too strong. Australia's capacity and Japan's capacity are somewhat limited. The value of the Quad right now is that it sends a strong strategic signal. It sends a strategic signal that today there's no collective security arrangement in Asia to limit China from developing its own relations, its own investments. But if China uses more coercion, more military force, starts putting even more economic and military pressure on US alliances, then this grouping could become the core of something that does look more like NATO someday. I don't predict that. I don't think that will happen. But imagine if China attacked India, or imagine if China used military force against the Philippines, not just building artificial islands and intimidating, but actually military force. When China killed 20 Indian boys in the Himalayas, Delhi embraced the Quad to send a signal. Imagine if there's an actual shooting war, not just a small skirmish. I think there would be serious debate in all 4 capitals about formalizing the Quad to deal with this threat. It is hypothetically possible. And to me, that's the advantage of the Quad. It shows what could happen if China challenges regional order too much. It would make no sense and not be possible to have a Quad alliance now. But the fact that these countries are strengthening their cooperation is a very important signal, and very, very different from a Russia, India, Japan trilateral, or BRICS, or something like that. Very, very different because of the potential for an actual alliance. Very hypothetical, but an important signal.
Let's move to the next question. What implication could Japan's remilitarization have on China? Will it ever happen? What should the Quad proceed in the coming days? How should it proceed? And what needs to be done to make it legitimate and formidable organization? So
Japan has remilitarized It's such a mixed picture. In Japan, they have a saying, there's a bug, an insect called tamamushiro. And the Japanese journalists and politicians talk about when something is like a tamamushiro. It's an insect in Japan, and depending on which way you look at it, it looks green or blue or red, the light changes. And Japan's remilitarization is like that tamamushiro, that bug that changes color depending on how you look at it. On the one hand, Japan's Navy, in terms of its tonnage and number of ships, is larger than the Royal Navy. It's larger than the British. Japan is developing more missile defense assets than any country other than the US. On the other hand, Japan still spends less than 1% of GDP on defense, and per capita defense spending in Japan is lower than Bermuda or Barbados or countries in the Caribbean that have no military threats. So it's a very mixed picture. I think that the trend, though, is quite clear. Japan will take on more military missions. Right now in Tokyo, there's a debate about what kind of strike weapons, what kind of missiles to develop to defend itself. And the US and Japan, India, Australia, they're all going to support this. The Koreans are nervous, but they won't oppose it. So you asked about the impact on China. The Japanese military was larger than China's military 20 years ago. Now, China's military is several times larger than Japan's. And the PLA Navy is adding as many ships as the Japanese have every 8 or 10 years. So in terms of just the scale, the Chinese do not see Japan as an existential threat. They respect the Japanese Coast Guard and Maritime Self-Defense Forces, who are very high-tech and very professional. And in a narrow confrontation around the East China Sea or the Senkakus, the Japanese would more than defend themselves in a limited confrontation. But the Japanese side realizes that in a larger confrontation, there's no way they can handle the PLA now. And so what is Japan to do in a situation like that? Nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons would deter China, but Japan's not doing that. Very strong allergy to nuclear weapons. It would be very risky for the alliance with the US. Building up the military. You know, Japan is increasing defense spending a little bit every year. China's military increases almost 20% every year. It's amazing. Japan's increases under Abe a couple of percentages, 7%, 8% a year. And before that, it was declining for over 10 years. So limited capacity to build up the budget, some new capabilities like missiles and so forth. I think the most striking thing Japan is doing to deter China is developing jointness and interoperability, a much tighter relationship with the US. The US-Korea alliance is joint and combined. If North Korea attacks, US and Korean troops will respond immediately together. The Japan-US alliance is not quite like that. But now the Japanese side and the American side is building it into that kind of alliance where we can operate jointly together. There's no way China can drive a wedge. My own personal view is that if China were to attack Taiwan, although Japan has no obligation to defend Taiwan, if the US responded, Japan would be in. Japan would be in. And I think the Chinese know that. So the Japanese main approach has been to strengthen and tighten the US-Japan alliance to make it more impenetrable for China and to make the Japanese archipelago, these islands, a kind of a picket or wall to keep the Chinese from expanding beyond the first island chain. Those geopolitical and military things are keeping the US and Japan very, very close. And then the India and Australia pieces are supplemental to that.
Let me move to the next question. How much commitment will the Suga administration have towards free and open Indo-Pacific at the cost of eliminating China? Now that Biden is back and the traditional US-Japan equation that looked hard under Trump is no longer a threat for the Japanese.
Suga is going to continue Abe's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, no doubt about it. although he was not publicly well known, he was the chief cabinet secretary. So he was behind the scenes, organizing and managing the cabinet. He is one of the architects of Abe's strategy, and he has said clearly he'll continue it. The Japanese political leadership over the last 2 or 3 years has somewhat moderated its approach to China for a variety of reasons. One is that 2018 was the 40th anniversary of Japan and China's Treaty of Friendship in 1978. And the two governments wanted to use that anniversary to try to stabilize relations. Because the reality is Japan and China have enormous economic interdependence. I went a few years ago, actually about 5 years ago, I went to Hakone, beautiful Japanese resort area, to a hot springs. And we had a conference of American and Japanese security experts on what to do about the China challenge. And then we would go to the hot springs and relax. It was very nice. It's a very excellent conference. That's the best way to do a conference. And the rest of the hot springs were Chinese tourists. So I was talking to the owner of the hot spring, and he was interested in our academic seminar. And he said, yeah, the US and Japan have got to have a strategy to stop China from dominating Asia. But we also want the Chinese tourists. Please don't scare away the Chinese tourists. Tourism to Japan has tripled since Abe became prime minister in 2012. And a lot of that is Chinese tourists. So Japan needed to stabilize relations with China for economic reasons too. But Abe had already demonstrated to the Chinese side that the alliance with the US was tighter, that relations with the Quad were strong, that relations with Southeast Asia were strong. So he spent his first 5 years pushing hard against China and Asia, so that, very deliberately, so that he could then dial down the pressure with China and try to have a more stable equilibrium. And that's what Suga is trying to do. He's not moving away from the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. He will continue strengthening US-Japan alliance and the Quad and relations with India and Australia. The Suga government will continue urging Japanese companies to repatriate out of China. But at the same time, Suga will try to manage China relations so that Japanese companies are not harmed and can benefit. So very delicate balance. And I think it's in some ways, it's a balance that India has to find, that Australia has to find, the US and Europe have to find. How do you compete strategically with China, which is using more coercion, more embargoes, more military pressure, without cutting off your own economic interests? And I think that the Abe and now Suga have found that kind of right balance better than the US or India or Australia or Europe. And I think it will be an influential strategy for the rest of us.
So let me put the last question as we're running out of time. We still have 27 questions, but maybe we should have another session regarding that. So the last question for today is how Japan is going to tackle its security issues with regard to North Korea missiles and problem in the Spratly Island where many countries have stakes.
So throughout Japanese history, the Korean Peninsula has been critical to Japan's security. Comparable to how throughout British history, the Low Countries were viewed. If Germany or France controlled the Low Countries, they could invade Britain easily. And the Japanese view of the Korean Peninsula for centuries was that it was, as one Prussian officer said, a dagger aimed at the heart of Japan. If Russia or China or Western imperial powers controlled Korea, it was too close to Japan, it could threaten Japan. So Japan has always been acutely sensitive to the Korean Peninsula. And over the last 20 plus years, North Korea has developed missiles, hundreds of missiles, nuclear weapons, and also chemical and biological weapons that can hit Japan. And that's why Japan has spent more than any country other than the US on missile defense systems. It's one of the reasons, in addition to China, that the US and Japan have been tightening security cooperation. But the oddity in this, the curious thing in this is, you would think, given the geopolitical challenge from China and the intense missile and nuclear challenge from North Korea, that Japan and South Korea would become as close as the US and Canada, would work very closely to deal with these challenges. But as I'm sure you know, Japan-Korea relations are incredibly complicated politically, with a lot of resentment on the Korean side of historical grievances, and a lot of resentment on the Japanese side that the Korean side keeps bringing these up and won't accept Japanese apologies and efforts to resolve them. And it's like a bad marriage. They can barely talk to each other. And the Biden administration is going to, I am sure, find a way to keep Japan and Korea together, to focus on the North Korea problem and China. I think the questioner asked about the Spratlys, which are in the South China Sea, but Japan's territorial problem with China is the East China Sea, the Senkaku Islands, what China calls Diaoyu. But the Spratlys and the paracels in the South China Sea disputes are really important for Japan too, because if China can dominate the South China Sea with its Coast Guard and its PLA and its military, it will have a chokehold on the sea lanes Japan needs for its own economy, and Korea and Taiwan. And so Japan, that is one of the big drivers for the Quad, that if China dominates the South China Sea, it cuts off Japan's sea lanes, but it also cuts off Australia. And some people say, why would China cut off trade? China is a trade-dependent country. Look, China is putting a massive economic embargo on Australia because it's unhappy with Australian criticism of Chinese diplomacy. China embargoed rare earth metal exports to Japan. China put an embargo, unofficial, but orchestrated an embargo on Korea for accepting American missile defense bases. China has clearly prepared to target even big allies like Australia and Japan of the United States, to target them for mercantilist pressure. And if China wanted to stop shipping in a crisis to Japan and could do it, it would use that tool, and the Japanese know it. And this, by the way, just to end, is one of the reasons why the Quad also has logic. Because although it is not a military organization, the fact is that the US 7th and 5th fleets, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, Royal Australian Navy, and the Indian Navy, if forced to, could cut off China's sea lanes to the Middle East. And so this is a very complicated game. Some people say it's a dangerous security dilemma. Each side is building up pressure. It's dangerous for peace. Others, realists, would say, no, we need an equilibrium. We need to establish mutually assured damage, if you will, that each of us can cut off each other's sea lanes in order to have peace. It'll be a big theoretical debate and interesting for our classrooms, but that game is on. That is a dynamic that we're now seeing. The Quad has become part of it, to answer the earlier question about the Quad.
Thank you, Dr. Green, for your time and comprehensive presentation. We really enjoyed the discussion. We immensely benefited from it, and we wish to have you again in future, maybe on some other topic. Hope to see you again in real. I'd also like to thank all our participants who are watching us on Zoom and Facebook simultaneously and shared interesting questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Green, and have a nice day, and good night to all our participants in South Asia. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you all very much. And I look forward to seeing you in Kathmandu next time.
Sure.